It's time to talk about the British Empire, British and American dialects. This this film is going to focus on the divergence of British and American dialects more than the importation of British Empire terms, which we can talk about in class and which your book covers. As you know, the British Empire began to grow after the 1588 sinking of the Spanish Armada, and it wasn't more than a couple centuries before, well, immediately Britain reigned supreme upon the seas, and Great Britain began to rule the territories all around the globe within a couple hundred years, partly very directly, as in India, and they conquered this towards the end of the 18th century. And there are a number of borrowings brought from there. Some of those are not words ultimately of in Hindi origin. Remember that India is a very diverse region in its own right, with not only different languages, but different language families, large ones being spoken. Some of them Indo-European, like Hindi, and others not. Pajamas there may come from Persian into India. Most of those are for things that people either didn't have back home, uh, by that I mean English speakers didn't have back home, or that they encountered in a particular way in India. So if your primary relationship to India is economic and you're there for trade and conquest and exploitation, then words for ready money like cash become an important part of your vocabulary. Curry, bangle, khaki, cashmere, chutney, these things have something more obvious to do with appropriating or borrowing aspects of Indian culture. Dinghy, the word for a little boat, comes from India, as though Brits didn't already have skiffs. But boats, as we know, have different forms, so you need technical distinctions there. Pajamas is probably Persian. Shampoo is interesting because it is an imperative verb form, meaning, hey, you scrub. Let that sink in your mind a little bit as you think about how borrowing patterns reflect power relationships among the cultures swapping the words around. Plenty of borrowings from China, including ketchup. There's a reason that we have controversies over how to spell it. It's borrowed from a language that doesn't spell sounds at all. So there, and it could be borrowed from Malay. It's hard. It's a regional word, so it's a little hard to tell. And of course, there are some phrases borrowed from China too, from the business pidgin in the trading ports in China. And it's well known that there are plenty of American words that make it into English and international English thanks to the colonial expansion of the British Empire. Early on, you have words borrowed from Native American cultures, some of them in rather appropriative ways, and others in others less so. You know, you encounter possum, you wonder what that is. You use a local word for it. The same goes for hickory trees, pecans. A woodchuck is interesting. In particular, that's a word that has been reanalyzed into English parts. So the the woodchuck phonetically resembles an Algonquin word for this critter, but it's when it's brought into English, it would be wrong to say it's a loan translation. This conglomeration of words has nothing to do with the meaning of the Native American word, but it's imitated. Its sounds are imitated with recognizable words from within English, wood and chuck. Let that help you try to figure out how much wood a woodchuck could chuck, a woodchuck could chuck wood. Uh, the original word, or I should say in its original context, the word woodchuck has nothing to do with wood or chucking. So there. But let's pause for a moment and think about British English. Again, I intend to spend more time on this in class, and of course we have plenty of material about British dialects in the folder accessible otherwise through the British Library. But notice that England's a really diverse region of speeches, and here of course we're looking at the entire British Isles, including areas outside of England. Scots Gaelic hangs on a little bit in the far west of the country in these islands, the Hebrides and so forth, and Irish, the Gaelic language hangs on in some areas in the west of Ireland and the south of Ireland. And all the Irish kids have to study it in school, but outside of a few areas, almost nobody knows it anymore. Everyone's speaking some variety of English. And you've got some areas where the dialect boundaries are really very tight. These are stable populations of people who've been in one place for a really long time, speaking differently from one another and learning whatever the modern version of their local dialect is as they grow up. Now, this map is a little bit historical in perspective. This is the way things have been. But thanks to modern culture, the dialects of England are becoming somewhat less diverse. Here we see a graphic example of that. And this focuses on a very specific pronunciation quirk. And as you know, all English speak was rhotic up through the 1600s until the middle of the 18th century. In the mid 1700s, uh, trendy folks in London began to drop the ahs off the ends of words or off the ends of syllables, and uh, and that caught on in London, and it spread through parts of England that looked directly to London for their influence. And as late as the 1950s, what we have on the left is a map focusing again on England in particular. On the left, we have a map of people who say their R's in orange and people who don't say their R's, who follow the London trend of non-rhotic speech in green. What you can see by 2016 is that the Scots and Irish and Northern Irish still mainly don't say their R's. However, you notice those are yellow now and not deep orange. And almost the entirety of England, the majority of the population is speaking non-rhotic English, is dropping the R out of as Londoners do. What could cause this to happen? Probably the influence of broadcast culture. So we have radio from the 1920s on and television from the 1950s on, and now YouTube and the whole interwebs too from certainly about 2007 or so on, 2006, 2007 on, meaning that lots of people are looking to London English or international imitations of London English for cues about how to speak, rather than looking at the traditional speech ways of their grandparents and great-grandparents who were speaking more regionally distinctive varieties back in the 1950s. Now, this map looks a little less diverse than the preceding one because it's really focusing on a single phonetic feature. The other one's taking into account all of the dimensions of language, uh, dialect distinctions based on um, based on differences of syntax, morphology, and vocabulary, prosody, and everything else. Whereas this is strictly about whether you say your R in arm or not. Nevertheless, it gives us a signal because that's historically a really important distinguisher between British dialects, the ones that are more Londony and the ones that are less Londony. One last thing I want to be sure you take a look at in this is notice that the south and west of England is non-rhotic until very recently, and Scotland and Ireland are, I'm sorry, I said non-rhotic. The south and west of England is quite rhotic until very recently, and the speech of Ireland and Scotland is also strongly rhotic even now, but certainly until quite recently, even more so. This matters for us when we start thinking about American English speech patterns, because immigrants from the British Isles came to England from different regions. And now I'd like to transition over to American English and think about some of those things. The question of whether you say R, that is rhoticism, is a distinguishing feature among American accents as well. And in particular, we associate it with some southern varieties. Virginia, Georgia, and New Orleans are famous for not saying their R's at the ends of words. And the same is true of some northern dialects, especially some around the major trading cities on the northeast coast. Here, this map shows a number of dots in places where non-rhotic speech has been recorded. And what I'd like you to notice is that non-rhotic speech is centered on Atlantic seaports that were active. Here's New York, there's Boston, there's Rhode Island, and here somewhere in here is Norfolk, and of course Charleston is not on the map, but it's in here, and New Orleans and Mobile. These are all important Atlantic seaports that were in business during the 18th century and that were in business with London. These are regions where, because of constant trade and economic and social relationships with London, American speakers caught on to that trend of dropping their R's, and they accepted it, and their descendants still often drop their R's. pardon me, if we draw some lines around it like this, we can identify regions where that's a characteristic feature of speech, and in fact we can include large areas of the so-called Piney Woods region of the South, especially down along the coast, as speaking non-rhotic dialects of American English. This has much to do with whether people in those regions, everything to do with whether people in those regions in the 1700s were staying in touch with London, especially port cities on the Atlantic coast were keeping in touch with London, but also wealthy planters in cotton country were keeping in touch with the with London. That's why prominent southern dialects, as well as some prominent northeastern dialects of English, share this feature of dropping the R the way Londoners do, when the interior of the country really doesn't. I won't go into too much detail about the array of differences that distinguish our American dialects. There are, well, it's an endless source of fascination, but the details there can bog us down a little bit. I'd like to observe the major differences that we usually recognize. There are southern dialects, and of course we have that region kind of cordoned off. There are Midland dialects, and then there are northern dialects, and notice New England gets its own little web of dialects. Finer distinctions can be made. The West tends to get lumped off on its own. It's not that there's no diversity over there, but the diversity is not as easily recognizable, and it's also not as regionally stable as it is in the East. And the reason has a lot to do with English-speaking peoples populating the West more recently than they did the East. Dialects have had longer to stew in their own juices in the East and have more to do with external settlement patterns, people coming from abroad to American soil, whereas in the West they have a lot to do with internal settlement patterns, people coming from the East or the middle of the country and moving out there and mixing up American dialects, which are already a little more similar. By the way, one of the reasons that American dialects together differ so much from English dialects is that they've been diverging for 400 years now. Since 1607 and 1620, there have been native English speakers in America, or shortly after that, nearly 400 years. And by 1776, there were about 4 million people speaking English on American soil whose parents had been speaking English on American soil. American Englishes have been diverging from British Englishes for a really long time. And if you wonder why Australian and New Zealand and South African Englishes sound more British, it has everything to do with those places being settled by English speakers much later. English speakers don't get to Australia and New Zealand en masse until shortly after the time when the American colonists were already fighting for independence from the Crown. If we take a look at this map, though, we can make a couple of observations that I'd like you to point out. You'll notice that the South is a more linguistically diverse region than this map lets on, and of course we could get very minute about that, but generally we know there are rhotic Southern accents and non-rhotic Southern accents. The non-rhotic ones are on the South, on the coast, in the port cities, and but the rhotic accents, as in Arkansas, the accents people say wash in, have a lot to do with settlement patterns in Appalachia, where I've put that blue oval. The people who predominantly settled here from England, well, I should say from the British Isles, are Scots-Irish. These are people who moved to the highlands of the Appalachian Mountains pretty quickly, away from the Anglophiles on the coast, and they moved there because they really didn't want to bother with London. They didn't care what was going on back in London, and they certainly were not wealthy people keeping up with London English speechways and new fashions. Their descendants, they kept the old R, their descendants still keep the OR, and as settlers moved from that zone of Appalachia west across Kentucky and Tennessee and into the Ozarks, they kept that R with them. And in fact, those upland, highland southern speechways make their way into the Midwest by following tributaries of the Ohio River. In fact, my mother's family comes from southeastern Illinois, right here, in an area, Crawford County, Illinois, believe it or not, which is near the tip of what's called the Hoosier Apex. The settlers from this region, including Abraham Lincoln as a young boy, moved out of Kentucky and followed the Wabash River up. And so there's a kind of triangle here of southern speech that reaches up to about Terre Haute, Indiana, and then stops. I went the wrong way. The Midland accents are a little more interesting too. One of the reasons they're rhotic, and their rhoticism goes all the way to the coast, has to do with the settlement of Pennsylvania. You'll remember from your American history course that Pennsylvania is settled by Quakers, led by William Penn, and that's why it got this name. These people are mostly from the west of England. They immigrated from British areas that had rhotic accents in the late early 1700s. They moved to Pennsylvania, and from there they moved across the middle of the country, or rather their descendants moved across the middle of the country. Much like the Scots-Irish, they really didn't care what was happening in London, and they certainly didn't care to follow London trends. That's why they became Quakers. It's part of their identity. And they kept the antique R in English. In fact, Quakers kept thee and thou for a while in English. That was sort of an archaism, but they kept the antique R, and their descendants continue to use the antique R. Their distinctive way of speech spread west across this area. But there's another part of the immigration story here. This is the region that German settlers were moving into during the early 1800s, and other Western European immigrants were, especially Northern European immigrants, very early on. By the 1820s and 30s, were settling in Pennsylvania en masse. Some of them still speak German. That's where we have Pennsylvania Dutch. But they and their descendants moved across this band through the good farm country, through the northern Ohio Valley. This has partly to do with timing. The northern Ohio Valley wasn't open for American settlement, well, I should say American English-speaking settlement, until the late 1700s. There were a couple of wars about that, you'll remember. And this influx of German settlers arrived at just the right time. So there's a particular influence of non-English speaking settlement in this region. And the descendants of those people moved all the way across this Midland area and of course up into Iowa by the 1850s or so, 1840s, 1850s. But by the 1820s and 30s, these English speakers and their German and their neighbors of German ancestry, including fresh waves of German immigrants, had settled all across this band. As late as the 1920s, there were still German-speaking schools in central Missouri. Look up the history of Hermann, Missouri, if you're curious about it. There's plenty more to tell about the diversity of American accents, but the moral of this story has to do with observing the way settlement patterns and economic relationships have to influence speech communities. Now, the great, huge piece of the puzzle that we're missing here, I mean, we're focusing on early Eastern America. We're leaving out a bunch of minority groups. We're leaving out Native Americans. That'll be addressed in some of the videos that I link to. We know very well that those peoples were rapidly displaced and didn't have much influence on the speech of European settlers, except to leave behind some vocabulary. And we're also leaving out African American vernacular English, which deserves much more attention of its own. That's also given some pretty good description in the videos that I'm going to link you to. But remember here that it is one of the southern speech varieties. It's now no longer a southern regional accent. This has to do with a series of migrations of African Americans out of the South, especially during the 20th century. And those migrations follow the famous Blues Highway, Highway 61, which roughly parallels the Mississippi River up north, and into the industrialized cities of the upper Midwest. And then later, of course, there's a migration out towards west, so that now this originally southern variety of English, African American vernacular English, is spread all over the country. It's no longer a regional dialect, even though and in fact, it's no longer a dialect. It hasn't ever been. It's a it's a diverse array of languages, uh, of language patternings in its own right, but it's no longer a regional variety or a group of regional varieties. It's a trans-regional variety, and it has an entirely different role in letting people express an identity than it did when it was confined to a particular area.